Say, one of the great innovations of Ezra, in which he quite literally changed the Kesav for Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzahs, but as the Radvaz is Masbir, it's not so much that he changed it, but he was actually restoring it to its original condition, and the question was raised about the recall notices on the existing Tefillin and Mezuzah. It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure logistically how that worked. Now, just to remind you, this is the second halachic innovation of Ezra. Remember, I mentioned an earlier one, just to remind you, that when Ezra brought a number of Jews with him, the year after the building of the Beis HaMikdash, there were no Levium that originally went with him. There were Levium who went with Zerubbabel, but there were no Levium who went with Ezra, and Ezra sent a request to surrounding villages to give him some Levium, and he got some Levium. And that's all that it says in the narrative. It doesn't say anything more than that, but in the Gemara in Yevamos, there's a whole sugya that Ezra created a knas on Shevet Levi, that they would no longer be entitled to the Maser Rishon. Right? The Torah says every single year, after you give Truma to the Kohen, you take 10% of your crop and you give it to the Levi, and that's called the Maser Rishon. It doesn't have to be eaten in Jerusalem, but it's given to the Levi. So Ezra made a knas that Leviim don't get Maser Rishon. But there's a machlokas in the Gemara what the knas was. Two different views. Knas number one, the first view is you don't give it to the Levi at all, you just give it to the Kohen, because the Oraisa, Kohanim are also Levi. So according to that view, the knas was Maser Rishon goes to the Kohen, it does not go to the Levi. Which is not really changing the Torah, because once again, under Torah law, every Kohen is also a Levi, but he prohibited giving it to a regular Levi because they did not voluntarily come to Eretz Yisrael. According to the other view, the knas was not quite as extreme. The Torah says you give it to a Levi, which would normally not mean a Kohen. He said you can give it to either a Kohen or a Levi. Right, so that's a machlokas, meaning am I allowed? Now, there's another machlokas in halacha. Was Ezra's takana only temporarily for that generation, or would it apply even today? Right, so that's there are two different machlokas. Machlokas number one is what was the knas? Machlokas number two is was it a permanent knas or was it only a temporary knas, right? So these are different opinions. But that is also attributed as a takana of Ezra. Now, when we say, by the way, a takana of Ezra, what do I mean a takana of Ezra? It does not mean that Ezra did it as an individual. Ezra didn't have the authority to simply make a rule, but it means the Sanhedrin was maskim to Ezra's takana. Yeah.
Is Ezra also credited with the Torah readings?
Right. So I'm going with that. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that now. So what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about some other takanos that are attributed to Ezra, that some of which we still keep today. Yeah.
Something you mentioned yesterday that Ezra wasn't the Kohen Gadol, at least right away. How are Kohen? Are they chosen? Is it like a group decision? Who chooses the Kohen Gadol?
Yeah. So in the normal course of events, it's very similar to a king. It is a hereditary succession. So the son of a Kohen Gadol would normally be Kohen Gadol. That's how it normally worked. However, that's not necessarily the case. If, for example, there is a better candidate, a more righteous candidate, just like by Melech, you can bypass the hereditary succession and choose the better king. You can bypass the hereditary Kohen Gadol and choose. Now, so the question then, who chooses at that point? So who makes that choice? So generally speaking, the Sanhedrin would be involved in making those choices. But again, there is a default rule that if all things are equal, it is supposed to go through hereditary succession. There's an interesting tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, by the way. So this is true for Malchus, and it's true for Kohen Gadol, that it's a hereditary thing. Is it true for being a Rosh Yeshiva? So it's an interesting issue that is still fought out even today, meaning a Rosh Yeshiva dies. So is there a concept that the son has some automatic right? Now, again, it's double pashut. If he's not the best person, for whatever reason, and that can get very ugly. But if that's the case, then for sure you can go outside. But let's say everything's equal. Is there a notion of some hereditary entitlement to positions of Torah? Now we know in Hasidic world, among the position of Rebbe, normally heredity counts for a tremendous amount, right? That's, I don't know if I would call it the crisis in Chabad, because the truth is Chabad seems to be doing Baruch Hashem very well, but people often like to talk about the crisis of succession in Chabad because the Rebbe did not have children. Again, as I say, maybe I mean there's a crisis they don't have the Rebbe, but I wouldn't call it a crisis of succession per se. But so in Hasidus, there's an old tradition that everything is hereditary. In fact, Chabad struggled with this at the very beginning. It's interesting, you know, the Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman, was the founder of this whole branch of Hasidus, Chabad. Chabad stands for Chachma, Bina, Das, and the Alter Rebbe's unique brand of Hasidus was that it was very much based on a highly intellectualized system. It's interesting. Whether Chabad remained that way or not is another question. I don't want to even get into it. But the Alter Rebbe was he was a Litvak, Lemaisa, right? The Alter Rebbe was a Lithuanian. Litvaks are very suspicious of emotions. They only trust the intellect. So much of Hasidus, Polish Hasidus, Ukrainian Hasidus, was very much into emotional feeling. The Alter Rebbe had a very interesting take on emotion. He was suspicious of it because emotions can give you highs and they can give you lows, and it's not a consistency. So he was determined to create a Hasidus which would indeed generate emotions, but emotions coming from deep intellectual contemplation. That's why it's called Chabad, precisely because he was creating intellectual, no Kabbalistic systems, but kind of intellectual Kabbalistic systems, whether it's Tanya, Likutei Torah, all of those things. You see, it's a very highly intellectually structured system. So when the Alter Rebbe died, the Alter Rebbe had a Talmud, a Rav Aaron of Storasilia, I think that's how you pronounce the city. And Rav Aaron of Storasilia was very close to the Alter Rebbe. He had learned with the Alter Rebbe for more than 30 years. And there were many Hasidim who wanted Rav Aaron to be the next Chabad Rebbe. But ultimately, heredity, did win out. And as you know, it was the Mittler Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe's son, who was also very great, but maybe he was not as close to the Alter Rebbe, in learning at least, as Rav Aaron. And that was actually a little bit of a crisis, because some made the argument that it's precisely the Alter Rebbe who would not automatically favor hereditary succession, because the whole concept was being attuned to this great philosophical system as opposed to just being automatic. So Chabad did face that crisis at the very beginning, but then it got resolved more or less that there would be hereditary succession. Each Rebbe did have a son or more than one son until the very last one, in which case Chabad didn't designate a Rebbe, right? It's not designated a Rebbe for that reason. Okay, be it as may, that's a digression. I'm just making the point that Ezra was not the Kohen Gadol, so I want to point out that you are correct. The Rambam says in the Hakdama to the Mishnah Torah that Ezra was a Kohen Gadol, and the one who followed Ezra was Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik is actually the first Tana. It's right at the very end of this biblical period. Now, the thing is, it's very clear that Ezra did not start off as Kohen Gadol, because the book of Ezra says very beferish that the Kohen Gadol was Yehoshua ben Yehotzadak. In fact, some even learn that one of the reasons why Ezra did not come up earlier. Now, I had given you the reason the Gemara gives, because his Rebbe Baruch ben Neriah was still alive, but some give the reason he didn't want to compete, so to speak, with Yehoshua, the Kohen Gadol, but at some point he did come up. So we have to assume that Ezra became Kohen Gadol after Yehoshua ben Yotzadak died. So you'll then ask me, what about hereditary succession? So I'll give you two answers. Either Ezra was so overwhelmingly great that superseded heredity, or I'll even give you a simpler answer. The one thing we know about Yehoshua ben Yotzadak is we know that his sons married Goyim. In fact, in the famous Nevuah of Zechariah, which we read Shabbos Chanukah. So Zechariah has a vision of Yehoshua, the Kohen Gadol, who is wearing filthy garments. And a voice from heaven says, remove your filthy garments and wear glorious begadim. And Yehoshua gets restored to pristine holiness. So Chazal understand that the filthy garments is a reference to Yehoshua ben Yotzadak's sons who had married non-Jewish women. And there were many people who said Yehoshua shouldn't be Kohen Gadol because of the sons. And this is a nevuah that says, take away your filthy clothes and put on beautiful clothes. In other words, Hashem is saying, you're still a tzaddik and you're not going to be disqualified because of your sons. This is how Chazal understand the nevuah of Zechariah. So if that's the case, it actually makes sense that Ezra would be the successor of Yehoshua, because Bedavka Yehoshua didn't have children who were ra'oi to be Kohen Gadol, or even Kohanim generally. By the way, there actually is a rule. If a Kohen is Oved Avodah Zarah, he cannot do Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. There actually is a rule like that. So if the Rambam is correct that Ezra was the Kohen Gadol, it is only after the death of Yehoshua ben Yotzadak, whose children were not worthy of being Kohen Gadol because they married non-Jews. We'll come to that also. Okay, so these are the two takanas we mentioned so far. He was Mahapech, the Kesav, from Kesav Ivri to Kesav Ashuris, and we went over the Radvaz yesterday. And the second, which I had mentioned first, is the Kanas, that the Levium would no longer have the exclusive entitlement to Ma'aser Rishon. So let me mention some others. A third one is what you had brought up, and that is he was Masake Kriyas HaTorah on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos Mincha. So here we have to remember the history a little bit. The obligation to read the Torah on Shabbos and on Yom Tov is not a Torah requirement, but it is as old as many Torah requirements. It is a takana that is attributed to none other than Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Moshe Rabbeinu enacted that we should read the Torah on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So technically, Kriyas HaTorah is midrabanan. Even if Moshe Rabbeinu makes a takana, if Hashem did not give him a command, it's drabanan. So this is almost like a party question you could ask. Give me is there ever any case of a drabanan that is older than a doraisa? Well, Kriyas HaTorah might be, because there were certain mitzvahs Moshe did not give us till the last day on earth. Kriyas HaTorah, we don't know when exactly, but that was earlier. Right? So you can have a drabanan that's earlier than a doraisa. Now, Moshe only was Machayev, Shabbos, and Yom Tov. And that might include Chol HaMoed as well. But the obligation of Monday, Thursday, Shabbos Mincha, this was a takana of Ezra, meaning the Sanhedrin as well. And why Monday, Thursday? So Monday, Thursday is because Monday, Thursday were traditionally market days. Remember, you have cities like Yerushalayim, but then you have villages. And some of the villages didn't have regular minyanim even in Ezra's time. But Monday, Thursday, they would come in, there were farmers or whatever it is, they would come into the city to sell their crops, sell their merchandise. So Ezra said that would be a good reason to kind of do a public reading, so even the people who come from the villages would hear a lesson of the Torah. Remember especially that Kriyas HaTorah historically had a bit of a different function than we have it today. Today, when you think of Kriyas HaTorah, you think of it as, well, it's part of davening. That really was not what it was. Kriyas HaTorah was a shiur to teach people Torah. Remember, there was a maturgaman. A lot of people didn't know Hebrew, even in Ezra's time. Aramaic was the spoken language. So what did a maturgaman do? After each pasuk, the maturgaman would give you the Aramaic translation. And Onkelos is fairly literal, but if you look at Targum Yonas and the other Targumim, there were midrashic embellishments. And many say the midrashic embellishments were what the maturgaman did. Now, I know people don't like long davening, so perhaps you might be grateful that we don't have in Kriyas HaTorah, drushos after every pasuk. But in fact, it was really a learning. Kriyas HaTorah was designed not to be liturgical, meaning not to be part of davening. Kriyas HaTorah was designed to be part of learning. And Monday and Thursday were seemingly the best days because that's when you could get your maximum audience. People who were not in town during the week were there on Monday and Thursday. Okay, so that's one Inyan. By the way, it's a little aside. Okay, it's digression, but it's an interesting idea. So there was the Maturgaman, right? And throughout the period of really from Ezra onwards, through the Mishnah, through the Gemara, there was a concept that there was a Maturgaman for Kriyas HaTorah, both in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael. There was no difference there. So the question becomes, I'm just asking, when did the minhag of a Maturgaman stop? So the truth is, Yemenites still have it to this very day. Yemenites still have it. Number one thing they do different is that the one who's called up to the Torah actually reads the Pesukim. Okay, but that's another issue. But number two, there's a Targum after each pasuk, and the Targum can be said by a katan. This is fascinating. So although the Baal Koreh or the Ola is a gadol, they give the Targum to a kid. It's a big honor. The kid says the Targum. So the Yemenites still do it, but among all Ashkenazim and among most Sephardim, we don't do it anymore. We don't have Maturgaman anymore. So when did it stop? So certainly it continued in the time of the Gaonim, but eventually what happened was it didn't make a lot of sense because people didn't understand Aramaic. So what are you supposed to do? What's the tachlis of giving Aramaic translations when you don't understand Aramaic? So they were mevatel the Aramaic. But then you'll ask, okay, don't have Aramaic, so read it in English. So two answers to that. Number one, they didn't want to institute other languages in the service because they didn't have the authority and the kedusha and the Masorah of Aramaic. Meaning, if you're not doing it with the official translations, we don't trust anything else to mamish be part of the liturgy. Number two, some say that today, at least, although this wouldn't cover all of the Middle Ages, it's in a book anyway, right? So what do I need the Maturgaman? If I want to follow the translation, I can look in the art scroll itself. By the way, this same debate parallels Shnayim Mikra V'Echad Targum, where people say, well, am I supposed to read Onkelos? Like, I don't get anything out of Onkelos. I mean, the other way around. The original idea was Onkelos would tell me what the Hebrew meant. Today, it's the other way around. I don't know what Onkelos says. What does Onkelos mean? I'll look at the Hebrew. I'll look at the Pasuk, and that'll tell me what, right? So what's the purpose? So some say this is still the Takana, and others say you can use an art scroll. In other words, Targum is Lav Davka Targum. It really means the basic translation. So Targum was the basic understanding translation. Today you can use another authoritative translation. So there are different shitos about being Makayim, Shnayim, Mikra V'Echad Targum with an English translation or the like. Okay, now the reason I'm bringing this up is the following. If you have a good memory, although you've been up all night, so you might be falling asleep, we read a very complex Aramaic poem before Kriyas HaTorah on the first day, I'm still thinking like a Golos yet, on Shavuos. There's only one day of Shavuos, right? And that poem is called Akdamos. It was written by Rav Meir Rav Yitzchak, who was the generation before Rashi, in a very, very complicated Aramaic, and it talks about the great holiness of the Torah, Olam Haba, the angels in Shemayim saying Kedusha, and how the Jewish people are even greater than the angels. We read Akdamos. Now, there's an interesting machlokes in halacha when akdamos is to be said. Now, I'll start with what we do first. What we do is before, right, a person is called up to the Torah, before he says Baruch Hu es Hashem HaMavorach, we say the poem of Akdamos, and then he says the bracha, and then we read the Torah. And that is how we practice it today. But that is not the original minhag. The original minhag of Akdamos was the person would make the bracha over the Torah. And after he made the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Nosein HaTorah, the Baal Koreh would read Akdamos, and then he would read the Psukim. The minhag was questioned by the Taz. The Taz, in the 1500s, said, that is not right, because you're not supposed to interrupt between the blessing over the Aliyah and the Aliyah. And therefore the Taz said, halachically, it is proper to move Akdamos before the Aliyah. Even though the original minhag was after the bracha. The Taz said, do it before because of hefsek. And the Taz's psak has been accepted. And that's why b'derech klal in every shul, Akdamos is recited before the bracha. So the question becomes, how do you understand the original minhag? So here is the point. This is very fascinating historically. The word Akdamos actually means introduction. What is it an introduction to? It is an introduction to the Aramaic translations of the Psukim that the Meturgaman is going to do. So as a result, when you had a Targum, pasuk by pasuk, Akdamos was part of that Targum process. So you could say it after the bracha. Just like the Targum is not called a hefsek. What happened was, at some point in the Middle Ages, Ashkenazic congregations stopped doing the Targum, but they still kept Akdamos. They kept the introduction without the Targum. At that point, there's no longer a justification to have it after the Aliyah or after the bracha. They had to move it before, which means the original minhag was defensible because Akdamos was connected to a Targum of the pasuk by pasuk. The problem was, the Taz is arguing, that it's now incorrect because you no longer have the Targum. It's very, very interesting that Akdamos is quite literally the introduction to the Targum of the Aseres HaDibros and the Kriyas HaTorah of Shavuos. What happened was, we dropped the Targum, we kept the introduction. Now the Taz argues you got to move it to a different place. Okay, so that's an interesting point. And the truth of the matter is, although in our Sidurim, the only liturgical introduction that survives is Akdamos, but in point of fact, there is an Akdamos to the Kriyas HaTorah of Pesach, to Sukkot, a different poem. There actually are these different poems, and all of them are introductions to the Targumim of the Yom Tov. So it's very, very interesting. I mean, the truth of the matter is, there is so much in the Machzor that has not survived, meaning all sorts of stuff. I have a set, there was it's really a little addictive. Don't use this for davening. There was a person, he was a frum person, but he was an academic, Dr. Daniel Goldschmidt, who was a very frum person, but he was an expert in liturgy and tefillah and the history of tefillah. So he put out some, and then his son-in-law finished because he was nifter. He put out complete machzorim for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, in which he brings all of the different piyutim that were said by all the different congregations, what they said in France, and what they said in Germany, and what they said in Austria, and what they said in the old Beis Knesset in Prague, which apparently had some unique minhag that nobody else was following in the world. These are the slichos that are said in the Beis Knesset Hayoshan, Shel Prague. And you actually see that all of the things that we think are unique, like the Akdamas poem, you have Akdamas poems for Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot. And the funny thing is that we're used to the idea that Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening is long and everything else is relatively short. The truth is, it's the opposite. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, they shortened it. There are more piyutim for Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot than there are for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. But what happened was, the Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot piyutim got eliminated, and some of the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur piyutim got kept. So we get this impression Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is long davening. It was almost the opposite. For various reasons, they wanted to shorten. Maybe not Yom Kippur, but at least Rosh Hashanah, they actually wanted to shorten the davening in some ways. So again, it's very, very fascinating. Dr. Goldschmidt's machzorim are really, really, maybe it's a little bit of an addiction that I have. I don't give that many shiurim on it. But you can absolutely not use them during davening because it's impossible. He'll have the piyutim that were said in France and then Germany. First of all, we don't say any of them anyway. So what are you going to do? But even if you were in a place like in Washington Heights, the Yucky Shulls still say some of the piyutim, but you got to have you have the France ones and this ones and that one and that one. So it's impossible to daven from at all. But it's very, very fascinating to learn the different types of things that were there. Okay, so be it as it may, though, the institution of Ezra Monday, Thursday, Shabbos Mincha is a takana of Ezra, Monday and Thursday because they're market days. In addition, there's another concept that it says that the Jewish people wandered in the desert for 3 days without water, and then they complained. So Ezra saw this as a little bit of a remez, that 3 days without Torah can poison you, and therefore Monday, Thursday conveniently creates, you don't have the 3 days because you read the Torah Motzei Shabbos, which is Sunday, and then you have Monday, Thursday, you never have, and then you have Shabbos, you never have 3 days without Torah. What about Shabbos Mincha? Why did he put in Shabbos Mincha? After all, you already read the Torah Shabbos morning. So it says, because of Yoshvei Koranais, for people who sit in the marketplace, right? Shabbos, people didn't have to work. So what did they do in the afternoon? They would sit around and schmooze and sit around and talk. He enacted a Kriyas HaTorah, again, not as a matter of liturgy, but as a matter of learning. So people would come and learn Torah Shabbos afternoon. Yoshvei Koranais. Do you remember, if you've made a siyum or you've heard a siyum, we thank Hashem that he put our chelik in the Beis HaMedrash and did not put us among the Yoshvei Koranais, those who sit in the marketplace. That language is taken from the Takana of Ezra because of Yoshvei Koranais. Now, interestingly enough, although I don't think this is connected to Ezra per se, let me talk a little bit about Haftorah. Right? We have a Haftorah on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, on the Tainus. What is the source of Haftorah? Where does Haftorah come from? So when I was a little kid and I first heard the term Haftorah, I came up with a brilliant explanation. I said, well, the prophets are not as holy as the Torah, so we call it Haftorah. So like half the Torah, no, the Torah and half Torah. But when I got to Havdalah, that didn't work. I didn't know what that meant. What does a $50 have to do with it? Okay. But be it as it may, the Haftorah dates much later than Ezra. The Haftorah dates from the Chashmonaim, from the Maccabees, which are almost 200 years later. And in fact, even after that, it may have been during the Chashmonaim, even after the Maccabees. We don't have a precise date. And that dated from a time when Antiochus, one of the things Antiochus did with all his other gezeros was he did not allow public reading of the Torah. He let people daven in shul. They could daven, whatever, but he did not allow them to take out a Sefer Torah, and he put guards in the synagogues to be sure that nobody would take out a Sefer Torah. So what the Chachamim enacted at the time was, okay, if we're not able to read the Torah, we will read from the prophets things that are connected to the Parsha. So originally, the Haftarah was not in addition to Kriyas HaTorah. Originally, the Haftarah was in place of Kriyas HaTorah. We weren't able to read the Torah, so we did something that, I'm always wondering, these guards seem to be so stupid. And why do they let us read the Nevi'im? I don't know, but Baruch Hashem, they let us read the Nevi'im, and that was a surrogate for Kriyas HaTorah. Later, when the Chashmonaim were victorious, and of course we were then able to have Kriyas HaTorah, they decided it's a good idea to have the Haftarah as well. Okay, so it's interesting that we keep the Haftarah even with the Kriya, even though originally it was in place of the Kriya. Now, Rashi says in Masechah Shabbos a very fascinating thing, which seems to be a lost minhag. Rashi says, Shabbos day, they read a haftarah from the Nevi'im. By the way, the word haftarah just means to announce. It's the announcing of prophecies, lahavtir. So Rashi says, Shabbos day, we read from the Nevi'im. Shabbos afternoon, there was a haftarah from the Kesuvim, Iyov, Mishlei, Tehillim. So Rashi says, and it seems to be that even in Rashi's own time, there was still such a minhag, that the third Eilah, the third Aliyah, was like a maftir who would then read a haftarah. Now we do read haftarah in the afternoon on a fast day, including Yom Kippur. So the concept of a haftarah in the afternoon is not totally unheard of, but we don't do it on a regular Shabbos or Yom Tov, and we also don't do it from Kesuvim. In other words, there are two chidushim here. One is to do it at Mincha, and the other is it's Kesuvim and not Nevi'im. We never do haftarahs from Kesuvim, but that's a fascinating minhag that Rashi records, and I myself don't know all the history of it, but obviously that minhag got discontinued. I am not aware of any Ada that does it. The closest we have is that many Yekis, many Ashkenazic Jews from German descent, after Shabbos Mincha, for part of the year, they say Borchi Nafshi. They say a whole bunch of Tehillim. I believe that some suggest that might be a remnant of the old minhag of a haftarah from the Ksuvim, although it's not said as part of a haftarah. Yeah. Say again? Yes. Oh, where do the Megillah? Rus. Yeah. So that comes from Maseches Seifrim. Maseches Seifrim, which is really from the Gaonim, already said that we have these minhagim. But some minhagim do not read it b'tzibur. Some minhagim means each person privately reads it. I mean, you'll read it in shul, but there's no bal koreh. People just say it to themselves. I think Chabad may have that minhag, but if not, other Hasidim very much do. They do not consider it a chayvas tzibur, and they don't make a bracha. And in Chutz La'aretz, even if we read it publicly, b'derech klal, they don't make a bracha. Here in Eretz Yisrael, based on the Gra, we do make a bracha. But the makar of all of those Megillas is Maseches Seifrim. And not only do we make a bracha, but we also say Shechiyanu, except on Tisha B'Av, where you make the bracha al Mikra Megillah, and because it's Korban, we don't make a Shechiyanu. So the Haftarah, I just again want to emphasize that although Ezra did create the Kriyas HaTorah of Monday, Thursday, Shabbos Mincha, Ezra did not enact Haftarahs. Haftarahs come much later in the days of Antiochus. By the way, another thing, you'll remember in the Kedusha of Musaf, we say Shema Yisrael, we say the pasuk Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That dates also from a later time of persecution under the Byzantines, where they used to put guards in the shul, so the Jewish people were allowed to daven, strangely enough, but they weren't allowed to say Shema. Right? So again, I'm always amazed at how stupid these guards seem to be. They can be very easily fooled. So since we weren't allowed to say Shema, they inserted Shema in the Kedusha because the guards left. Once you started davening Shemona Esrei, the guards they knew that Shema had passed, so they left. So they snuck at least the first pasuk of Shema in the Kedusha, because on a Torah level, many Shitas say you fulfill the mitzvah of Kriya Shema with the first pasuk, right? So a lot of these things come from persecutions, but often the commentaries are not misudar in terms of when it happened. For example, they'll mention the Shema thing as also in Antiochus' time. It was not in Antiochus' time, but they sometimes use the old villains as pseudonyms or names for the new villains. Okay, stop.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.